Thank you, Pastor. Thank all of you. It is a privilege to be back at Cornerstone. It is 4.5 years ago. I actually looked back at the video that we put together that Saturday and Sunday night, 24th and 25th of May. I noticed that both the pastor and I have gotten a little grayer. We both have a little less on top. I now wear glasses. I didn't have them on before, but I've not only grown gray but nearly blind, to paraphrase George Washington in the service of our country. When I was here the last time, I had just come back from Iraq. This time I'm just back from Afghanistan. And Fox brought me back because I've got a new book out, which I had a new book out then. You helped make that book a bestseller. And so Pastor said, bring the book along, and there it is. And we'll do that afterwards. I want to just share with you some thoughts about what the pastor just said about role models, because that's what this book is really all about. That's what my life has been all about, not as a role model, but looking at the role models of others who I consider to be American heroes. Now, I know I say the word hero, and I've immediately conjured up in the minds of some young people someone wearing a spandex suit and a cape, or someone who just caught the pass in the end zone at a Friday night football game. But in fact, the definition of a hero, the classical definition of a hero, is a person who puts themselves at risk for the benefit of others, knowingly putting themselves at risk. It could be all kinds of different risk. That's the kinds of folks that I write about in these books. They're real people. They've done these things in reality. Sometimes you have to make it a novel because otherwise you'd be disclosing things. If you put the real names and the real places and the real dates and times in, would increase the risk that they're already in. I just left Fort Campbell on the way here. We literally arrived breathless, just in time for the prayer beforehand with the pastoral team and out. And I saw there at Fort Campbell some of the heroes who are in this book. I have a great advantage in seeing them because I've seen them on the battlefield. I've seen them in places where their lives are at risk for the benefit of the rest of us. Those are special people to me. They are young people who serve in remarkably difficult and dangerous places. When Fox saw that I was getting ready to launch another book, they had me get back in time for Veterans Day and for Thanksgiving, and they had us put together a quick video sampler of what it is that I have done for the last 11 years for Fox. I showed it to Betsy when we first got home. She said, I wondered where you were for 11 years. This is what it looks like to have 11 years summed up in about 1 minute and 45 seconds by Fox News. There's a member of every branch of the U.S. Armed Forces in this video. There's literally every theater of war that I've covered in 55 embeds, literally all over the globe, covering American soldiers, sailors, airmen, guardsmen, and Marines. It's kind of a recap of those 55 embeds. There are conventional forces in here. There are special operations forces. There are troops in gunfights in Afghanistan, Iraq, Philippines, Africa, Central America, the Persian Gulf, the Indian Ocean, Somalia, and the Gulf of Aden, not to mention Mexico. All shot with our helmet cams and our little tiny cameras that we carry with us when we go to cover these Americans serving in harm's way. I point out they serve not for gold or colonial conquest or for oil, but they do that to offer others the hope of freedom like we enjoy in America and nowhere else in the world. They didn't go to the mall on Black Friday. They are, in many cases, still in harm's way. Some of those that I saw just literally days ago in Afghanistan have now arrived back home on C-17s like the one you just saw taking off. And I got to write Night Stalkers Don't Quit on the books that they bought today at Fort Campbell. Those are the heroes that look after us in those faraway, difficult, and dangerous places. And for that, we ought to thank God every Thanksgiving. I was I was asked by one of the reviewers who had reviewed my book if the people are real in this book, even though it's a novel. I said, let me just describe to you the takeaways, if I can, for what's in this book and why I wrote it. And it's from a real event. Some of you may remember, because we've been reminded of it so often, that Osama bin Laden was killed in May last year, in 2011. Tragically, on the 6th of August last year, 13 of those Navy SEALs who participated in that operation were killed when a CH-47 crashed after it had been shot down, and they perished instantly in that fiery inferno. The squadron commander of that unit was a person I knew well. His name was Jonas Kelsall. Jonas Kelsall grew up literally all over the planet because his folks were in the service. But he married a young Marine captain that I had introduced him to. His funeral was held on the 23rd of August last year at Columbia Memorial Baptist Church in Falls Church, Virginia, where they had walked down the aisle together. You see, her dad and I were very close friends. We'd been Marines together. We came back to Quantico, Virginia together. He went to the FBI, and I went to teach young lieutenants at basic school. When Jerry Jennings went off to his career in the FBI, he became remarkable for his service a second time. And when we were at the White House together, when I checked in at the White House, he was the security officer for the National Security Council staff. One of the takeaways from life is the world gets smaller the older you get. And Jerry's little daughter, Victoria, used to run around at the White House with one of my little daughters, who are about the same age. On the 23rd of August, Victoria Kelsall and her family were gathered for the funeral of her husband, killed so tragically in that helicopter shoot-down. Some of you may remember the 23rd of August last year was not only the day for that funeral, it was the day for an earthquake in Virginia. Now, I know some of you may be from California, where a 5.8 magnitude earthquake is no big deal, but it is for us in Virginia. And in the midst of that funeral, that earthquake occurred, and the chaplain who was standing on the podium right before that flag-covered casket with Jonas in it paused for a moment. Well, there was an enormous crack that sounded to me, and like many others, to many others in that room, like it was a car bomb going off at some distance. But instead of the effects of a car bomb with a shock wave, there was a big crack, and then the church began to shake literally back and forth. The chandeliers above us were shaking. Some of you may remember the next day, there were photographs in the newspapers and even on Fox News of people running from buildings as far away as Philadelphia. The earthquake occurred at Lake Anna in Virginia, hundreds of miles away. But people ran out of buildings in Washington and Philadelphia and Baltimore. And yet in Columbia Memorial Baptist Church, not one person got up and ran. The Commandant of the Marine Corps was sitting right in front of me, each one of us escorted by a Navy SEAL. This was not something open to the public because you had so many special operators there, they didn't let the public in, only the friends and the family. I wasn't there for Fox News. I was there as Victoria's friend, her dad's friend, and as a believer in the church where they were married. The commandant turns to me in the midst of the shaking of the church and says, "North." That's the way commandants talk to lieutenant colonels. "North, there's a message in this. No one's running." And the SEAL sitting next to him said, "General, we don't have to run. We know where we're going." Now, if you don't understand, that's real. Well, you may not be surprised to find that story, or one very close to that story, in this book, because you see, Jonas Kelsall was a role model, not just as a heroic Navy SEAL, not just as a person who could take on any mission, and to include going all the way to Abbottabad in Pakistan to kill Osama bin Laden. He was also the kind of person who would stand before his fellow warriors and be unafraid to be seen reading from this book. You see, this isn't one of Ollie North's novels. I've been all over the world with these youngsters. they can take vulgarity to the level of a new art form, I can tell you that. But they're also unafraid to be seen reading from this book. They're unashamed of their faith. When you see what you're about to see on the screen, you're going to see, when I was here 4.5 years ago, I showed you some frames from the footage that we'd shot. I just showed you some of the footage in actuality. I want to show you an updated version of what I put on the screen 4.5 years ago. These, it's called a word picture, if you will, of what they really look like, what they're really like. Not the press version of it, not the media hype, but the real American heroes who literally go on the line every single day. Each one of those ones you see up on the screen are frames from footage that we've shot over the course of that 11 years. I've learned from them that I'm no longer as fast as I once was, but I can still keep up with a sergeant from explosive ordnance disposal when he yells, "Run." I've learned from them the extraordinary power of faith, and I understand from these youngsters what the true meaning of commitment really is. You see, these young Americans in flak jackets and helmets have become the protectors of Muslim women and children. They have shown as role models the right way of doing things, and they don't or rarely get the credit that they deserve from our media. The critics of the media abound. 2.4 million young Americans have served in the uniform of the armed forces of the United States. They still carry too much on their backs. They can take a weapon and use it like part of their bodies. They can use their bodies like weapons. They can take a life or save one with it because they've been so remarkably well trained. They operate and use the most sophisticated weapons and equipment ever designed by the hand and mind of man. And yet, when you see them on the battlefield, the way they really are, not the way they're portrayed by a media team that comes in and spends 2 or 3 days, or maybe even just 2 or 3 hours with them, just to find some bad news story to talk about, you realize that to an extraordinary extent, they are young men and women of great faith, not just great courage. They understand that war is 95% boredom and 5% stark terror. They're willing to give their lives for their fellow mates. They understand the nature of the fight that we're in against radical Islam, which is very often missed. They've been in it. What they've faced is far more akin to what my uncles faced in World War II in the Pacific than anything we've ever experienced before, because the enemy they're up against is very often suicidal, who intends to die. And how different that is for them, who understand for us, those who know this book, all the dying was done 2,000 years ago at a place called Calvary. The very songs that we just sung a few moments ago, making that evident. When you look at these young Americans, there is a factor that rarely gets any acclaim at all. I showed you this slide. It's one of the few that's still the same as the last time I was here. It's always the last one when I give a presentation about who they are, because this is a vivid example of what can only be described as Christian compassion. In the center of the screen is the United States Navy Medical Corpsman. I would not be alive today but for the corpsman who saved my life on the battlefield in Vietnam. He's in that book, by the way, Jack Fowler. This corpsman is rushed out on the battlefield when the rifle company with which he is serving is attacked by a Republican Guards regiment, about 700 of Saddam Hussein's finest, on the 6th of April, 2003. Without any concern for his own safety, he rushes out on the battlefield and starts putting battle dressings on wounded Marines and carrying them on his back to a helicopter. And I'm now on the ramp of the helicopter shooting toward him as he's carrying the third casualty. If you look carefully at the frame, that's U.S. military battle dressings on a wounded fighter, but that's not a U.S. Marine he's carrying. That is a wounded Iraqi soldier. He's risked his life to go on the battlefield in the midst of this gunfight to save the life of an enemy combatant. What you can't see, and I didn't because my face is right up against the viewfinder on my camera, is the Reuters news crew that's set up just to the right as you look at that picture. That's one frame out of what went on for a good 10 minutes. The corpsman lays the wounded Iraqi on the ramp. A shock trauma corpsman picks him up and puts him in a litter. They start an IV, wrap him in a shock blanket, and the crew chief yells, "We've got to go." The bird is being shot full of holes. The corpsman runs off the bird, and I'm running to keep up with him behind. The bird takes off, and you can hear the Reuters news crew over the din of the battle shout out, "Hey, mate, what did you do that for? Didn't you notice that was an Iraqi?" In other words, you stupid American. And the corpsman gives what I can only describe here in church, Pastor, as a gesture to the Reuters news crew. They're not supposed to get that part. And he shouts back at him, "Didn't you notice he was wounded?" That's what we do. We're Americans. What a remarkable tribute to who they really are and what they're really like. I said to you a moment ago that they exhibit faith and courage, and they know the power of prayer and the power of a role model. The role models in this book are taken from my life. They're the ones who really, really have done it. I just couldn't put all their real names in it. It's kind of a summary of where I've been for the last 11 years. It's the kind of thing that you look at in this day and age and you say to yourself, gee, we've got a lot of problems. What's the answer? What are we going to do? How are we going to deal with all the challenges we face? There's a lot of those in this as well. I noticed the reviewers, when they're going through it, gloss over those aspects of it. And I've kind of concluded it's because so few of them understand the issues of faith that are in this book. They don't grasp it. They can't because they haven't been grounded in what's in this book. Now, Pastor mentioned role models just a few moments ago up here. Let me tell you why I think that's important, why this book focuses on that aspect of life. Be very straightforward. If it weren't for a role model in my life, I would not know where I am going and why I am going there. And if you don't understand what I just said, meet me at the book table. I'll show you. The fact of life in mine, in this book is written about something in the future. I don't know the future. I don't have the gift of prophecy. I don't know your future, but I do know mine. Pastor mentioned eternity right here. I know where I'm going to spend eternity. Has nothing to do with how many medals I have on my chest, how many combat action ribbons I've got, how many times I've covered troops in combat. Has absolutely nothing to do with how good a journalist I am or how good a bestseller author I am. Doesn't have anything to do with how good a husband and father I am, or now the grandfather of 14. Yeah. I just a quick sidebar on that. Literally just got back in time for Veterans Day. Our daughter gave birth to our 14th, and I was trapped in Florida by a hurricane. There's a hurricane in this book, strangely enough. And I didn't write this last week. I finally made my way back up to Charlottesville, and I've just had my day. It took me 9.5 hours to get back from visiting troops that were wounded that I'd covered out there. It took me 9.5 hours to get to Charlottesville from Florida, and I finally got there. I got the picture, which is obligatory for if you're the granddad of 14. Each one of them, you got to have the picture because they're going to ask someday, where's the picture when I was born? You may have missed mom and dad, and I did miss a bunch of their parents, but I didn't miss any of them. And so I've had my day made, and I'm walking out of the hospital, and I noticed there's a gentleman walking from Charlottesville, Virginia, for those of you who don't know, is a very liberal town. It's home of Thomas Jefferson's University of Virginia and several others. And I see a gentleman walking in front of me who's about my age and about our age, pastor, with hair about our color, but he's got a ponytail right down to here. And it's very nicely braided. And he's walking to the front. I said, where have I seen this before? And he gets to the fire door going into the parking garage. He looks back and sees it's me and lets the door go right in my face. Not going to bother my day. I just got to hold my brand new granddaughter. I walked out the door, and there he's standing there. He says, I recognize him. He's a college professor at the University of Virginia. He's a Marxist, and he teaches economics of all things. I don't know what's going on in his heart, but I don't think he spent a lot of time in this book. He looks at me and says, "What are you doing here?" We'd spoken before. We'd seen each other. And I said, "Grandchild." He looked at me and said, "I was hoping your kind wouldn't procreate." No, it's great. You can't take my day away. I've just held my granddaughter. I said, "What are you doing here?" He said, "Grandchild." I said, "How many?" He said, "Our first." And I said, "Procreate." "Our 14th. I wasn't being a very Christian role model. I was just trying to make him feel bad. There was a role model in my life, and I want to talk to you about him, and then we'll wrap up. I was a very successful young Marine. I had probably the best reputation of any captain or major in the Marine Corps, because people used to write that on my fitness reports. People used to write down, "This man should be commandant on the Marine Corps someday," and I used to believe them. In 1975, I was assigned to Headquarters Marine Corps, and I worked on the other side of a partition from a lieutenant colonel. Actually, he was a major when we both started. I was a captain. He was a major. We both got promoted early to the next higher rank. And I used to watch him regularly because he was known as the smartest guy at Headquarters Marine Corps. When I would go down to brief the Commandant of the Marine Corps, General Wilson, Medal of Honor recipient from World War II, General Wilson would say, "Has Grinnell seen this?" Meaning the major on the other side of the partition. I'd say, "Oh, yes, sir, Colonel Grinnell's, or then Major Grinnell's, has approved it." Well, when he got selected to be a lieutenant colonel, he leaned over the partition one day and asked if I would like to be his operations officer in a deploying Marine battalion out of Camp Lejeune, North Carolina. Here's what went through my head. He's the smartest guy in the Marine Corps. He was the top of his class at West Point. I'm from Annapolis, but I can overlook it. He's also got a copy of this book on his desk, and I used to catch him reading from it on government time, but I can overlook that. Because everybody knew he was going to be a general. I said, "Oh, yes, sir, I want to go with you. Hook my wagon to your rising star. I'll go be your operations officer, the number 3 officer in a deployed unit." We moved almost a week or so later to Camp Lejeune, North Carolina. He took over as the battalion commander. I took over as the operations officer. And just before we deployed to the Mediterranean to become the landing force for the 6th Fleet, it was our sister battalion that got blown up in Beirut. That's the kind of deployments we had. It was another one of our sister battalions that rescued Scott O'Grady when he was shot down over Bosnia. That's what that unit does. Just before we deploy, they take you out on a big field exercise. And because I could adjust antennas even better than the communications officer in the battalion, I'd climbed up on the back of an armored vehicle to adjust the antennas. Can you imagine what it was like to work for me? I've thought about it several times. This guy said, "There's the major again. Yep, he's doing my job. That's good, Major. Hope you don't get electrocuted up there." And instead of climbing down on the ladder built into the side of the armored vehicle that is there for that purpose, I'm in such great shape, and I wanted to impress everybody, I jumped off the top of the armored vehicle. It's about 8 feet. And I landed all wrong. I injured my back in exactly the same place it had been broken in a parachute accident in 1973, an automobile accident in 1964, and I knew what I'd done. The pain was terrible. The feeling went out of my legs. And the Sergeant Major, Ed Johnson, stood over top of me, looked at me and said, "Corpsman up," meaning the corpsman, "get somebody in here. This guy's hurt bad." Instead of the corpsman, the next person who came underneath that camouflage net was Lieutenant Colonel John Southey Grinnell, top of his class at West Point, Rhodes Scholar, MBA from Harvard, White House Fellow, and, oh yeah, born-again Christian, whatever that meant. Grinnell says, "I'm going to kneel down and pray beside you, Major." I said, "Oh, sir, I'm hurt bad. Let's do this the regular way with a board and a helicopter and get me back to the hospital." He ignored me. He closed his eyes and he put his hands on me and he said, "Lord Jesus Christ, you are the great physician. You can do anything. Heal this man." Now, that fast, the pain went out of my back. Feeling came back in my legs. I got back up off the dirt, which I could not have done a moment before. I looked him in the eye and I said the stupidest thing I could possibly have said. I said, "Thank you, sir." Colonel Grinnells grabbed me by the flak jacket and pulled my helmet up right next to his. He said, "Major, don't thank me. Thank your Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. You had better come to know him." All that happened in front of dozens of Marines, dozens of them. Sergeant Major Ed Johnson, tough, crusty Sergeant Major, eyeballs the size of saucers. 2 weeks later, the battalion deployed to the Mediterranean. You line up on the pier at Morehead City, North Carolina. There's the 5 amphibious ships you're going to be going on. You load up, and the remarkable tradition of the Marine Corps was when you're embarking on one of those things, the operations officer gets to present the battalion to the commander. "Sir, Battalion Landing Team 38 prepared for embarkation." And the normal command, tradition has it going all the way back to 1775, is very well embark the troops, and he'll take out a map or something symbolic to the trip and hand it to the operations officer. And instead, he takes out a copy of this book in front of the division staff, in front of all the widows and wives and sweethearts that are lined up crying behind the chain link fence, because we're going to be gone for 7 months. And he takes it and he slaps me just like that in the chest. And he says, "On the way across the Atlantic Ocean, read this, Major." Very well, sir. Turned and embarked the troops. We got aboard the USS Austin in the case of the command group, an LPD. And on the way across the Atlantic Ocean, I picked up and read this book from cover to cover for the first time in my life. You were a prisoner. I was embarked. You and I came to know Jesus Christ, not through testimonies of others, but by reading this book. It changed our lives. I would never have done that but for the role model in my life. John Grinnells changed my life by insisting that I read this book. It's a good thing that happened in 1978, because in 1981, I got sent to the White House. I learned about the power of prayer in that book. Good thing. Actually, the moment of conversion, because that's what it really is, the moment of conversion occurred when I got to Matthew's Gospel in the 8th chapter. I started at Genesis. I mean, that's what you're supposed to do at the front of a book. Darn near quit at Leviticus, right? Huh? But I got to Matthew's Gospel, the first Gospel. I got to Matthew's Gospel, I'm reading it for the very first time in my life, and I suddenly realized what was going on in life. 8th chapter, verses 5 through 13. Don't look it up now, get it later. Here's the Marine Infantry, the MIV, that's the translation I've got, Marine Infantry version. In the MIV version of the Bible, it goes like this. Jesus is preaching in Capernaum. He's on the front steps of the synagogue. Capernaum is the town where Pete grew up in. His mom is cooking pizza for these 12 guys right down the street from the fishing pier. I've been to Capernaum. In fact, I'm going back to Capernaum with 150 couples here in January because I got so outraged, and I don't mean this is a political statement, it's not, no politics. But there was a political party that held a convention in North Carolina, and they decided to take God and Jerusalem out of their campaign, and I decided I was going to go there and show everybody why it's important. And so in January, if you want to join me, there's a folder out there. We got space for 15 more couples. Now, I got to that gospel, and I'm reading about reading what Matthew wrote about Jesus teaching on the front steps when a Roman army infantry officer walks up. I get infantry. I was an infantry officer. A centurion is an infantry officer. He commands 100 Roman soldiers, a company roughly. And so the Roman army officer walks up to Jesus while he's in front of the synagogue preaching, and he says, "Hey, Jesus, I've got a sick servant at home. Would you heal him?" And Jesus turns to him and said, "Well, sure, let's go." He said, "No, Lord, I'm not worthy that you should come under my roof. I'm a person of authority. I get authority. I understand it. I'm a person of authority. I can tell someone to come, and they come. I can tell another to go, and they go. I get it. You're a person of authority. All you need to do, Lord, is say the word, and my servant will be healed. It doesn't say it in Matthew or Luke where this story is recounted. Luke, by the way, says it was a slave of the centurion. Jesus has got to smile at some point in this and say, you get it. Go ahead on home. It's done as you ask. And we know, because both Gospels are the truth, that in that very moment, that second, that servant was healed. That is the truth. Because every word in this book is true. Now, I looked at those words, read them on the USS Austin just before we pulled into Roe to Spain, and I realized this is what John Grinolds did for me. This role model in my life had the courage to tell me to read that book. You see, it's against the rules for a senior to proselytize to a subordinate in the military. Some of you are in the military. I can tell by your haircuts. It's okay for the sergeant to tell the lieutenant, you ought to read this book. It's okay for the corporal to tell the sergeant that, but the sergeant can't tell the PFC that. You run afoul of the Uniform Code of Military Justice, and John Grinolds had done that right in front of everybody. And I realized that's why Jesus says, after the Roman army officers walking back to his barracks to find his servant healed, he says to the 12 who've worn out their sandals walking all over Galilee with him, greater faith than this in all Israel I have not seen. The words of Jesus Christ in the gospel. Why does he say that? Very simply. He knows that a Roman army officer is subject to the same sanction as a traitor with whom they would collaborate. In other words, simply by talking to Jesus, who is eventually executed for the crime of treason, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. That was the crime for which he's executed. This Roman army officer could also be executed for the same crime, and there were lots of people taking notes on who talked to Jesus because we know how they all end. They all end for the same reason, the same way. The Roman authorities put them to death. And this Roman army officer serves at the pleasure of the Senate and the Roman emperor. He has put himself at risk for what? A promotion? A pay raise? No. He's put himself at risk for a sick servant, a subordinate at best, a slave at least. That's what John Grinolds did for me. You talk about a role model. It's astounding to see what a role model can do in the lives of others. Pastor stood here a few moments ago and said, what about you? What about each one of you as a role model? That's why I write these books. That's why all my books are about heroes, because we ought to be looking up at heroes. We ought to give us something, even if it's just peripheral, as something to look up to and hope to do better. And my hope is this is kind of a covert operation. You see, this is a secular book. This is about terrorists and remarkably brave young Americans who go out and do battle with them, very much like the ones that I cover day in and day out for Fox. But the element of faith through all of that is the real message. I had that driven home to me day in and day out, right up to literally my last days in Washington. I got to see the faith of a president. I got to see the faith of good people around him. And oh yes, I got to see what it's like to go testify before Roman emperors, members of Congress. Last quick story. First day of those hearings, summer of 1987, people said to me, how could you get through that 9 days of all of that and you didn't even break a sweat? And I would tell them, well, you have to know where you're going and why you're going there. And I know that went right over the heads of most of the reporters who would ask the question. The very first day of those hearings, we brought the security team that protected my family and me from the terrorists who tried to kill them, brought us in through an underground garage, up a back elevator, through an empty corridor, and put us in a holding room across the room from where all the hearings were going to be held. And the security guy said, stay here until we come back. And I got down on my knees next to Sullivan, the lawyer who sat next to me through all that. Dear Lord, if there's ever going to be an earthquake, let it be this morning in Washington. And there wasn't. And then came the knock on the door. And they'd gotten, in addition to the 8 security guys with us, they'd gotten 12 or 14 Capitol Hill police officers in uniform who brought us in the center of this cordon across the hall to the hearing room where the great big doors were. And there's this gaggle at the doorway, and all of a sudden, out of nowhere, a little lady with white hair reaches through the door and puts this card in my hand. Do not send me any of these videotapes. I have nothing to play them on. But people have sent me literally thousands of copies of the videotape of Sullivan and I walking through the door of the hearing. All the cameras in the world are going off, and you can see Sullivan taking this card out of my hand and putting it in his pocket like this. And he's going like this, and you can't hear what he's saying for the noise of all the reporters and the congressman up on the dais. But what he's saying is, don't be reading things other people give you, just let's get this over with. But when we sat down at the table, Sullivan takes out the card and he puts it on the microphone stand. And it sat there throughout. And the third or fourth day of the hearings, one of the reporters got to Sullivan before the security team could close back around us. He said, Sullivan, I've got to know, what's on the card? Because on the cameras mounted behind the potentates, you could see the card. You could see Sullivan take it out of his pocket, prop it up, but that's all you could see. And Sullivan goes like this card. He says, yeah, what's on the card? And without showing it to him, Sullivan says, the answers. Brendan Sullivan gave me the card after it was all over and said, you probably want to hang on to this. I know it means a lot to you. We had prayed beforehand. We prayed every day. I know the power of prayer. Every time I come back from a trip overseas, my son-in-law is the pastor of St. Peter's Church, an Anglican church in Purcellville, Virginia, tells me the congregation's been praying for my safe return. I know they've been answered. There have been helicopters I've been on over there that were shot down. I survived. There's a reason why. I don't know what it is. I don't have the gift of prophecy. I simply know where I'm going. I hope you know where you are going. Oh yeah, the card. This is the card. It's the same one. I've carried it with me ever since. I keep it right there in Matthew's gospel because that's where it all started for me. That's not the end of the story. That's the beginning of the story. This is what's really on the card. They that wait upon the Lord shall renew their strength. You wonder how you get through the tough times? They shall mount up with wings as eagles. You know how tough it is to keep up with a 25-year-old wearing a flak jacket and helmet? They shall run and not be weary. I am tired, but I'm not weary. They shall walk and not feel faint. I have fainted a couple of times, but never to endanger another. And that's all part of Isaiah 40:31. Sullivan was right. Those are the answers. God bless you, and thank you for being here tonight.